This has been an interesting project for me. My family, some of them were involved, and I listened to the stories and saw certain things that were still around when I was a child. But I do have to issue a disclaimer. Not everything always lines up the way you'd like it to line up. There are some discrepancies. I'll pick these out where I can, and I'm hoping when my presentation is over, if you've got anything else to add, I'd love to hear it. There have been fires in Georgetown. Some of them serious. Some 10 houses may have been burned at one point. Others were just single dwellings. But this was a terrible fire. I'll get into what made it terrible. The first thing I'd like to do is start out simply. This is William and Edith Marr. If any of you know Edith, you'll see that this is a very young picture of her. This was taken right after they were married, and they moved into this modest house on the edge of Gott's Cove. It was an old house. It was pretty well run down, but it was theirs. And on the morning of Thursday, May 31st, that's what this house looked like. The next morning, it looked like that. The first picture was taken from the front of the house. This one was taken from the back of the house. And there's some things, if you look at the cellar hole, you can see that there was a tremendous amount of devastation. But the interesting thing is how surgically the fire came through. This is it went through unscathed. There's a cottage off to the right, took some hits to the roof, but that was it. Well, what you can see here is that the fire headed up this way onto a hill overlooking Five Islands. One thing I'd like to pick out is out of that cellar hole came this. It's a bottle. There's a bottle cap in there. I would pass this around, but it's got some sharp edges on it. But that gives you some idea of how intensely hot the fire was. So, let's head on. Monday, May 28th. There's some discrepancy. I mentioned that I'd bring up some discrepancies. There are some write-ups that will show it as June 3rd. And a lot of this was taken from a letter written by Agnes Powers. She was up in Robin Hood and able to see the fire. But if you look at the date, she wrote it after the fire. And she talks about the first day of the fire being on Monday, May 28th. Let's see what was going on. To get our bearings, you can see that this is a map of Georgetown. Let's zero in on a certain part, the northeast quadrant, right here. And we'll zoom in on that. And there is where the fire took place. Now, if you look down in the lower area, you'll see there's a little point there. Let's take a closer look at that point. The point is called Parker Island. And what was going on is the Coast and Geodetic Survey had been tasked with mapping or surveying the coastline. I was surprised to find out the Coast and Geodetic Survey was begun by Thomas Jefferson, but here we are in 1934. There's a crew here working. Now, they were putting in a bronze plaque. I don't have a copy of that, but I will tell you, if you've ever been to Reed State Park, if you've ever been up on Griffith's Head, right behind where the binoculars are, there's a plaque. That's a bronze plaque that was also put there by the Coast and Geodetic Survey. So right in this point is where that crew was working. Here's another discrepancy. Some call this Chase's Hill. Most of you who live around Five Islands now know that Chase's Hill, as we know it today, is closer to Charles's Pond. But I submit that the Chases lived over on the shore at one point, so not too much of a stretch to call it Chase's Hill. Now, their work, you don't have to read this, but this is just an excerpt from the summary of what the Coast and Geodetic Survey, I got this off the web, and it talks about 1934 activities in Georgetown. It talks about where that point is, and that's what gives us one of the references to where it is. But right smack in the middle of that is this note that talks about the summer of 34, a large area of the island was burned, and the station, the point I just mentioned, was the southern tip of that burned area. Well, it's pretty much common knowledge that it was the survey team that caused the fire to happen. So didn't quite bring it out quite that way in this write-up, but that's what had happened. Catching up with my notes. Let's begin. So we'll go here. We'll take a look. Right down here is that point again. And at that point, the team is working. The survey team is working. And on this particular day, Monday, the 28th of May, one of two things happened. And this is where we have discrepancies. One version of the fire says that the crew sat down at lunchtime, made a small campfire, and cooked their meal. Another version says that they were putting up a lookout tower on this hill, and that they had cut brush and they were burning the slash as a result of their cutting activities. Whatever it is, they started a fire. And they attempted to put it out. And for all intents and purposes, looking around by the people who lived in the area, nothing was going on. But by the middle of the afternoon, smoke was rising from the area. And one of the selectmen said, we should do something about that. So they went to the town hall, not the town hall we know now, but the town hall, the old town hall, it was between the bridges over Robin Hood Cove. It was closer to the westernmost bridge. The town hall is gone now, but inside that town hall was the sum total of Georgetown's firefighting equipment. There was a selection of pickaxes, shovels, and a couple of Indian pumps. Everybody know what an Indian pump is? Yep. On your back, you pump it yourself. So they went up and they did the best they could. They cut the fire down and watched it for a while. In fact, they watched it during the afternoon. They watched it into the evening and into Tuesday. And at that point, they figured, well, this is out. We're done. We'll withdraw. They did. On Wednesday, the 30th of May, it was quiet up on the hill. There was a funeral for a Stearns Scott. I believe it was in the church in the center of town. I'm not quite sure on that. Somebody may be able to fill me in. But when about 3 o'clock the mourners came out of the funeral, there was a pall of smoke and some flame visible up on that hill I just showed you. So they rounded up a crew and went to address it. At that point, the wind, you can see the arrow there, the wind came out of the south. Now it did burn a little toward what we know as Morrell's Corner, down to the old Morrell place down in this area here. It did burn some that direction, but it took off on the ridge. It went up the hill. It went very quickly the rest of that day. And the old Jim McMahon farm was right in here, and it went up to the east of the old Hagen place. If any of you know Bill and Emily Herman, that's the site of their house now. So that's about as far as it went at that point. On Thursday, May 31st, the fire was still active. They'd knocked it down some, but the Jim McMahon place, I think, had to be put out 5 times. It did not burn. The rest of the farm was pretty well gone. On Thursday, you can see that it worked its way over to what we know as the Little Sheepscot between McMahon and the island of Georgetown. And there it sat for a bit. But in the afternoon, the wind sharply came out of the northeast and started blowing the fire toward Five Islands. And this is where the devastation happened. A lot of trees were burned so far, but up until now, we haven't seen that much personal property destroyed. So now, if we go in, here's Five Islands right here. And we can see, and if we get the next slide up here, that's a close-up. And that shows you some significant things. It shows you the hill right here, overlooking what you now know as the wharf in this area right here. So the fire is bearing down, it's coming over. The first thing it does is to come out of the woods and hit Ellie Pinkham's house. Ellie Pinkham lived, I kind of covered it up with the arrow, but right there. And here is Pinkham Court. I see Frank Pinkham here. He should be familiar with that area. And a funny thing happened. It burned Ellie Pinkham's house and somehow jumped over the gathering of houses right here. Another interesting thing happened at that point. Henry Moore's house. Henry was a lobsterman of great fame around Georgetown and Five Islands. But at any rate, he and his wife, Levisa, lived right just over the hill. They had 5 sons, all of them, well, I think all but one were lobstermen. They had the 5 sons, one of them, Dennis, disappeared right as the fire's coming in. His mother, Levisa, is just out of her mind trying to find him. And he was gone. We couldn't find him. They couldn't find him. All right, now, here comes the fire. It's coming over the cove and over the southern tip of Cove right here. And that's where the that picture I showed you first happened. Now, let me go back one, just to say, that is where William Marr's house, right here. The fire hit his house, didn't hit the house and barns right here, and only did minor damage to the cottage next door, but it went up on the hill. And I'd like to give you a glimpse of what was on that hill. This was a beautiful cottage. What I've indicated as number 1 here is the Horton cottage. They lived in Philadelphia, and they had a beautiful, beautiful home. And number 2 is Captain Will Davis's house. You can see the chimney peeking over the top of the tree line there. And number 3 is Captain Ira Lewis. It's unusual that we have 2 schooner captains on top of this ridge, but those were their houses. There were other cottages in the area, and we will take a look at this shoreline right here. Keep that in mind as we go through these slides. That shoreline, if you had the opposite view, would be looking out on Crow Island. The cottages up there that you couldn't quite see through the trees were actually from the ridiculous, this one being a small cottage, to the sublime. So the fire is up on the hill. It's over, and the other portion of the fire was coming down and going toward the Grange Hall, which is now the community center and the church in the center of town. People were trying to get that under control, and there wasn't much damage there. But if you listen, I would like you just for a moment. I've got a question. How many of you had Edith Marr in school? I see some hands. I see some hands. You're going to enjoy this next piece. What I'd like to do is just a short tape of her talking about the fire. It was her house and her husband Williams that was the first one on this side of the town, the Five Island side of the town, to be affected.
A desperately dry time.
Can you hear this all right?
The road was just, and everything
Many of you
around was
recognize
so
the voice?
dry. I remember walking to see a friend a few days before that and noting how dry everything was. Well,
Was it the fall, Edith?
no, it was in the spring. It
Was it in the
was
spring?
the last of May, the 31st of May. And evidently they thought they had it out, I suppose. It sprang up. The volunteer fire department that we had at the time put it out, watched it for a day or two. They felt they had it all conquered, and it burned underground, the roots and like that, and it sprang up again. So the whole place was apparently burning that evening. But somebody said, oh, the north end, everything's gone up the north end. And it was just, and the smoke was pouring up, you know. It was a strange thing. That afternoon, I was trying to get the house ready to go to work. And I had done some ironing, put things up on the dryer and everything, you know, and put everything in order. And I've always said it was the only time in my life I ever had everything in order in the house. And that afternoon, we could see the smoke rolling up, the billows of smoke. We didn't know where it was going to go.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, if I don't wash the kitchen floor today, I may never have to. But you know, I decided I'd do it anyway. So that was the last time on that. I remember walking around through the house and looking around to see if the fire did come here, was there anything I would want to save? There was no place to save it, because you take it out and you didn't know where the fire was coming.
Sure.
So but those were the thoughts went through my mind.
Where did you go?
We went out in a boat, and this was my idea, I guess. We had took his mother and Mrs. Cubbage, who used to live up there in the same place that the Worrells had afterwards.
Yeah.
And I guess perhaps it's Sister Lou who was with us. We had a few things with us. We had a suitcase with some things, but I didn't take the most important things, you know. And so we were out in the boat, I was thinking about getting them out of the area. And as we were out there, the wind changed. And all of a sudden my husband said, there goes our house again. And he bent over the steering wheel like on the boat, you know. We went up to McMahon and stayed up there overnight in the house that George Luber used to stay in. But it was really quite a time.
And that was the Depression years, people were poor.
34.
Oh, it was
God.
terrible.
We owned nothing.
And this, you had to rebuild here?
So that, but you know, the Red Cross did a lot to it. People, like people on McMahon, different people, some people like that, gave a lot of money to get this place started and Deacon Pinkham's place up the north end.
I want to cut that off there. It's an extensive tape if you care to listen to it. It was done in 1981 by Tom Brown and Ben Burr. Anybody who is in a historical society knows the value of capturing that when you can. And we're very, very fortunate to have that. That speaks about the sense of immediacy that, like, I call it a terrible thing. There's another reference I'd like to make. Some of you have read the book by Tom Hanna, Shouting into the Fog. Well, earlier in 1994, Tom was beginning to cut his chops as a writer, and he submitted an article, a short article. If anybody reads the Down East, you'll realize in the back page is always something going on there, some write-up. In May of 1994, Tom wrote an article called 5 Islands Afire, and that actually was the beginning of the chapter that went into his book, the chapter of the same name. Just a quick, this will give you some sense of immediacy. Tom, by the way, and the Hanna family lived, I gotta get my bearings here, right in there. So they're in the same place. They can see that fire coming. Here's what Tom wrote. Around 6 p.m., my father rushed in and firmly instructed my mother, get the children together. We have to leave now. Alarmed by his stern tone, Tommy says, I ran outside and was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the fearsome conflagration. All around, trees exploded into flame. Live embers rained down and like a dense blanket of roiling black smoke darkening the sky. With only the clothes on our backs, we hurriedly piled into my father's Studebaker and cleared the village, our headlights piercing the smoky gloom. I didn't look back. My parents and grandparents had all been born in 5 Islands, and my father had built our home just 6 years before. I'm afraid the house won't make it, he said quietly. Tight-lipped, my mother just stared straight ahead. The town hall was a few miles down the road. This is one I mentioned earlier with the firefighting equipment in it, and had been opened as a shelter. My father dropped us off, returned to the village. Several families were already there, but the hall was ill-equipped to accommodate us. From time to time, neighbors from 5 Islands came in with news. Some of the villagers who had no cars had literally to run for their lives. Others had gathered around the town wharf, and we'll see that in a moment, how prominent a part that played. They were waiting to be evacuated by water. A fire engine from the city of Bath had been set up at a small pond in the center of town and was pumping water onto the most threatened homes. The National Guard and many students from Bowdoin College had also been trucked in to help man the bucket brigade. Despite their efforts, the reports were depressing. Ellie Pinkham's house is gone. Hannah's is still there. William Mars is gone. Each was followed by a hushed murmur. When he leaves and his father comes after the fire has passed, he comes back and says, the next morning my father came to take us home. Our house had been spared, but we were totally unprepared for the devastation in our neighborhood. Solitary chimneys rose starkly from the still smoking ruins, a reminder of homes that had been. To the north, a cluster of blackened skeletons stood where a stand of graceful evergreens had been only yesterday. That gives you a sense of what they were up against. They were, in fact, terrorized. Let's get back to where we were. This is where the fire did its most damage. I mentioned those houses already, and I mentioned the small cottage, and I mentioned the large one. This is Merwick, by the way, the Hortons from Philadelphia. They were traveling outside the country when the fire hit. And on the other side of the hill was the home of Jake Lewis, the son of Captain Ira Lewis. Interesting thing about this, I'll give you some insight on how it affected people. Jake, when the fire Burns swore he was going to put the house back. And he said, I'm going to put a house back that will never burn. And he did. The entire house was sheathed in galvanized sheet metal. Some of you may know that house now as being the home, while she was alive, of Electa Reynolds, a noted painter of Five Islands, Georgetown, and the coast of Maine. Whoop, there we go. All right, so we're back to this hill, and I want you to keep that shore in mind, and keep the houses there in mind. And also, there's one way out on the point here. Notice how close it is to the wharf. Maybe 300 yards. Have any of you had some seafood at the wharf in Five Islands? As you stand and look out at Hendrick's Head, to your left, there's a beautiful home. And its predecessor was just a cottage right there. And this is a 1984 view after some of the homes had been rebuilt. Again, this is that shore I mentioned. This is where the fire did its damage. Here the people were out on the float. Needless to say, this is a contemporary picture of the wharf. But the people were out on the wharf, and very close by, there's that house I mentioned, they could see the fire burning behind it. They knew that they had to be rescued soon, or they were in terrible danger. There's the fire. Now, it's me doing a little Photoshop on it, but that's where the fire burned. Happily, if there's any good news here, the Rockmere cottage, the Warrells place, was not burned. But the fire is now bearing down on this cottage right here. And the people on the wharf are terrorized. Suddenly, out of the south came a sharp breeze and knocked the fire back on itself, and it burned out. On Friday, June 1st, largely most of Five Islands was getting back to normal. And now the stories abound. Anybody who's been around Georgetown and Five Islands know that one of the ways people get by is to tell stories. And this was no exception. There was a story when they were trying to empty the houses of their furniture, they put them on trucks and tried to get them out of the area. Well, unfortunately, one of the trucks hit a rut and went into the ditch. And out of the back came an upright piano, out onto the road. Fortunately, the piano remained upright. And during the night, the people in the area could hear the firefighters as they'd stop by the piano and play a tune or two. One of my favorite stories was of Mr. Norton, who ran a fuel company up in Bath. I think it was called Acme. And he had a cottage in Five Islands and had heard that the area was burning. So being a sharp guy, he had a few of his crew, went out, took one of the delivery trucks, the tank trucks, with Acme emblazoned on the side of it, Acme fuel, and pumped it out of all its fuel, replaced it with water. Then he raced down to Georgetown, into Five Islands. He and his crew took the hose out from the truck that usually is used for delivering fuel and started wetting down their house. Well, native came by at that point, looked at what was going on, shook his head, walked down the road until he met another neighbor, and he said, "There's some nuts up there. They're trying to douse their house with gasoline." So at this point, Five Islands is recovering. But the fire doesn't stop here. With the wind out of the south, it boils up and heads back up the north end. It goes along the bank, up the Narrows and along the Little Sheepscot, and a low point escapes the flames, but Soldier Point, the furthest point there, the fire is very active there. And in fact, some of the embers went over in McMahon Island. I think there were 5 attempts to get over there and get rid of any fire that had started. And again, it was just people that would go in, put the fire out and leave. And then somebody else would see something else happen, they'd stop by, they'd put out the fire and leave. So it was in constant danger, but the island did not burn. However, up here in Westport, the southern tip of Westport, one of the people who lives out on the point of Westport realized that the fire is just across the Goose Rocks Passage. The wind is out of the south, and embers and sparks are starting to fly and come down on the area, southern tip. So he took a quick run up to the middle of town and tried to get the town fathers together to put some people together on the point to save the tip of Westport. Well, they were way in the inland. They were up to the north end of the island. They really were not enthused about getting anybody together. So the individual there who owned the house on the tip looked at him and he said, if my house goes up, I'm going to go after your houses until I run out of matches. Apparently that worked, because there were a great number of people down here just making sure that that it didn't catch, and in fact it didn't. But back over in Robin Hood, Marguerite Zorak, the wife of William Zorak, a painter in her own right, a well-known painter in her right, and also the mother of Dalof Ipcar. She's out there taking a look, and brush in hand, easel and all, she paints the fire. It's a bit, well, let's see, the artistic license is there, as you can tell. But it was in the same time frame, and we know of no other event that would have caused that amount of smoke, and that's from Robin Hood looking east, and that's the fire as she saw it. So we've seen the fire, where it burned, and what happened afterwards. Well, in the aftermath, this is on top of the hill. These are some of the cottages you could not see until, on the previous slides, until the fire had burned them out. And right here, I don't know if you remember it or not, but I mentioned Captain Ira Lewis's house. Captain Ira Lewis had a beautiful home, as I think you might remember on that previous slide. And he sold the house to, of all people, Imogen Guiney. Imogen Guiney, you might remember, was the poet who lived down near Harmon's Harbor and sold her property to F. Hollanday, and that's where the chalet, F. Hollanday's. But she sold, and I didn't realize it until within the last couple of weeks, that she actually owned a house. She sold it to Charles Moore from Belmont. And you can see it right here. And this is not a very good picture next, but that's the house. Terrible devastation. Mr. Moore came rushing up from Belmont. He got to the fire scene. He said, well, that's it. Got in his car and decided he'd go help people. And as he rode around, he ran into a little child who was lost. Guess who it was? Dennis Moore. Yep. And then he found out where he lived and took him back to Henry and Lavisa, and I know they were grateful for the part he played. So that's how things worked. You know, people who were from away worked with people in the community, and although they couldn't save the houses at this point, they did their job. The interesting thing about the fire is that a lot of fire companies worked on it. the Bath, Wiscasset, the National Guard, the state police. There were quite a number, but there was no one running the show, so to speak. Had there been somebody who could understand what was happening and relate to it, the thought was that they could have had a patrol up on top of that hill, but no one thought of it. Because again, the CCC was working by itself, the National Guard, they would just run to where there was a fire. And at that point, when they got to the fire, in this case, it was too late. So let's take a look at some more here. This house, this picture I should say, is a picture of Gott's Cove. And you will see this is the southern tip of the island of McMahon. This is the southern branch of Gott's Cove, and the William and Edith Marr house is right over in here. This was taken some 18 years after the fire. You can see here what had happened. You know, you can see there was a substantial growth of trees there, and in 18 years it hadn't come back. Yeah, it was a hard time, but I'm telling you, for about 20 years after the fire, there was some of the best blueberrying you could imagine. So today, just took this one yesterday, same place, same cove, McMahon in the background, and you can see that finally it's come back to the way it was before the fire. So, there we are. We're back to that burned out cellar hole. And you might have heard Edith mention that the Red Cross was involved in helping, and it sure was. They provided the funds so that some of the houses, specifically this one and Ellie Pinkham's, could be built. And here is the house under construction in August of 1934. My Uncle William wanted that house up fast, and much to the chagrin of his older brother, he put the house right back on the stone foundation where the original was, and you can see it there. So that house on the side of Lewis Road, I can now reveal that this is how I'm really attached to this story. This is the same house, and it's the house where my wife and Carol and I now live. So that's the story of the fire. If there are any questions at this point, any comments, I know there's some controversy in there. I need to mention one thing. You know what the most helpful thing was to knock that fire down? The telephone. Telephones were not that common on the island. And had it not been the ability, I think there were some 400 calls that came out of the island. They would say, call up and say, well, such and such a place is burning, and somebody would go after that. Had it not been for the telephone, the devastation would have been much greater. It was 16 in all, and over the bulk of them, at least 12 were on top of that hill. One thing I should mention is every time you hear a fire story, they're always talking about what the damage, how much does it cost? And at that time in 1934, the estimates were staggering $75,000 to $100,000. But if you extrapolate into today, you know it was a fairly devastating fire. As I mentioned early on, all they had was pickaxes, Indian pumps, a few shovels. Was not, probably within a week of the end of the fire, Fred Carr, a native in Five Islands, got some people together in the store, when there was one, down near the wharf, and they got together and say, we can't let this happen again. And that was when they formed the Five Islands Firefighters, which is now better known as the Georgetown Fire Department. Thanks for your time.